up on our screen, we have Karen A. Chase. I was very confused because she is not to be confused with Karen, another writer on the internet. And yeah, when I first was looking, it doesn't look like her at all. So let me give you some background. I had read Karen's work and seen her in the distance at various James River Writers Organizational events, and was really wanting to see if I could pursue having Karen come talk to our class. And then sent her an email, and Karen didn't get back and didn't get back. And, you know, even if I'm trying to be open-minded, there was part of my head that was going, well, how rude, at least she can say no. And then we had another person. Rand was also somebody, Rand Walker, I believe you know him, Karen. And he was somebody that was like, would you come speak to us? And he's like, well, the only day I can come is, it happened to be the day that I had originally set up Karen to come. So I said, okay, so Karen, thank you. But if you're not even going to be nice enough to say no, then, you know, you're off the docket here. And Karen, in the meantime, was doing her very best to kindly say, yes, indeed, I'm happy to talk to your community college students, no problem. But the college's security, for some reason, didn't like the look of Karen. I don't know. So, and to explain how diligent she was, she tracked me down during the pandemic. We made the connection, and I feel closer to Karen as a result of that snafu than I'd have any of our other speakers, because at some level I was thinking bad thoughts about her. Anyway, none of those are justified. Let me tell you a little bit about Karen. Karen was born in Calgary, Canada, which is, if you've been up north like that, you know it's a beautiful place. She got to tour the United States with her parents in an RV. She also became a history buff somewhere along the line. And so when she moved to Richmond, she was able to coordinate her two loves, and that is writing and history, and apparently bringing it all together in book format. She's the author of a couple of books. Her first, Bonjour 40, a Paris travel log, received 7 independent publishing awards. She also won recognition for the book that I am particularly interested in, which is called Carrying Independence. That's book 1 of a 3-part founding document series. And for her pandemic project, as if we're not busy enough, she wrote a food-themed story called Mary Angela's Kitchen. And I am so very excited to have Karen give you her spin on her wedge of this writing world. So take it away, Karen.
So we have a mix, if I'm not mistaken, of novelist people and historical nonfiction. Is that correct, Kim?
Yeah, Karen, I think the best way to look at it is this is an introductory class. Okay. And so we have some of our students are pretty proficient at writing. They have come to us from, you know, some professional writing background like Cheryl. We have people who are very interested in writing novels. We have others who are just exploring their own creative side. I think after Rand was talking, I have people who are, you know, like shockingly fascinated by microfiction. I've been having students sending me just on a whim over spring break their various microfiction attempts. So he inspired people. So we are really kind of all over the map at our background, but what we share in common is this sort of love of this. So.
Well, and I do too. As you can tell from the books that I've published, I've been all over the place too, between memoir, nonfiction, travel essay, historical fiction, and then Mary Angela's Kitchen being just foodie fiction, just 100% invented, minus the recipes, of course. But for me, the historical fiction is the real love, and that was what I was going to focus on today, was how I go about doing some of the research for that, and whether or not you're writing nonfiction or fiction, if it comes to research, I hope, some big chunks of this will be applicable to you. So I'm going to share my screen because I do have a PowerPoint because I like pictures. All right, can everybody see that okay? Yeah. And I am going to have a Q&A at the end. So if you have questions and you want to type them into the chat, or you just want to wait and actually ask them, either way. Okay, let me hide this a little bit. So as she mentioned, my name is Karen Chase. Yes, there are a couple other Karen Chase writers. We've actually all met and had lunch together, but that's a side note. So my big historical fiction novel, Carrying Independence, which is what the poster is for in the back, takes place during the American Revolution time period. I am not an historian. I am a novelist. And so my research began here at the Berkeley Plantation, which is just east of town. I'd actually been starting to write a book about the Constitution, and I made a list, which I strongly recommend historical novelists or even nonfiction writers do. I made a list of all the things I knew I didn't know about the time period. And then I just started going down the list and learning them. And it started here at Berkeley. And I was on this tour, and Berkeley Plantation is the home of one of the signers of the Declaration of Independence. Even though I was writing a book about the Constitution, I knew I didn't know about 18th century plantation life. So I was on this tour, and the docent pointed to this copy of the Declaration and said, not all the men were in the same room on the same day to sign this document. Out of the 56 men who signed it, 7 were missing. He shrugged. We have no idea how those 7 affixed their signatures. Maybe it was carried. And he walked out of the room. And my head went, oh my gosh, that's a way better story than what I was working on for the Constitution. And if I'm going to work on a book on that, maybe I need to learn about this document first. So I think the first lesson I'm teaching here is that sometimes you need to be open for where the story is. And when it comes to you, you pay attention and change tact. And it was one of the smartest things I did. And it sent me off down this rabbit hole of learning all I could possibly learn about the time period. And I am a big believer in learning about it firsthand. The more I could immerse myself into that time period, the better. So that's me eating a garden out of Stratford Hall, the garden of Richard Henry Lee, one of the signers of the Declaration. I learned how to make rifles. That's me wearing all the layers of petticoats required for the time period. I was an extra on Mercy Street for a day just to submerge myself into the past. Got paid $50 to do it, but even though Mercy Street was Civil War and I was Revolutionary War, still I could understand what those layers of clothing felt like. And then that is my spouse, Ted. We were at a lot of places where there were reenactor cutouts so he could stick his head through. But, again, immersing yourself in the time period is a little bit what we're going to be talking about when it comes to conducting research. And if it's not a time period you're in and you're in present day, immersing is still important. But for me, this is a quote I like to share: writing fiction allows us to live more lives than just this one. Writing historical fiction or nonfiction, exactly the same, but more notes, and you need a DeLorean or a time traveling machine. And for me, that was a huge benefit. I love travel, and being able to go back in time on a regular basis was really fun for me. But as you know, this is what I mean by more notes. So I have one chapter in my book that is about the Battle of Brooklyn. And it was weeks and weeks of research in which I learned all about how many troops were fighting for both sides at the Battle of Brooklyn up in Long Island. I had to rebuild the timeline. I looked at copious maps like these two, which are just mind-numbing after a while, that talked about troop movements and where they were coming from. And I looked at historic paintings and gathered all my data, but that doesn't matter to the reader. This is the viewpoint they want to see. Even if you're writing historical nonfiction, they want to get in absolutely tight and follow a character. And so this leads us to our first point here of what is the goal of reading for our readers? What is it they want to learn from us? And certainly the Underground Railroad, boys, rowing to victory in 1936, a woman that follows moss. I mean, these are the things that they're going to be learning about along the way. But it's more than that. Readers really want to connect with that time period. They want to feel when they lift their head from the book that they've been back in time with you. And the only way that they can really do that is to feel from the characters. So in Colson Whitehead's book, for instance, you follow Cora. You're not following just a group of people. You're not following the history and the events all linked together with nothing central and moving about it. So you really want to feel what the characters are feeling. Early on, I worked with an editor in my book, and she gave me this advice. Jane Rosamond was my editor, and she said, historical writers are like an iceberg. You have to know and learn 100%, and you have to show 10. So the big question then is, how do you learn everything that's within this iceberg if you are not well-versed in time? This is my cat Olive. She's showing you her tail here. If you are not well-versed in a time period or your subject, you could be writing current day nonfiction, for instance, about hair color. And Malcolm Gladwell did a huge piece on hair color. Malcolm Gladwell, I would wager, knows 100% about the history of hair color and how we got to where we are, but he only shows us 10%. So how do you get here? And there are 4 or 5 assets I'm going to go through so that we outline the kind of the process of how you piece all this together. And early on, I created this chart for myself. It was my networking chart, and it's going to look overwhelming on the next page, but we'll talk about it. So what I really wanted to do was I wanted a way to simplify all the pieces and parts that I was going to be gathering. There's a tremendous number of people that you end up coming into contact with over the course of a book. Whether or not you're writing pure fiction or whether it's historical fiction or nonfiction, like we talked about, you're going to have different categories of people that you need to be in touch with. So there are, of course, publishing contacts, like, for instance, your teachers, and all of the people in this class fall into these groups. You have other contacts. I mean, I wrote in numerous coffee shops back in the pre-pandemic times, BC, when you could sit in a coffee shop and write. So I would keep a list of that, local personalities, that sort of thing. But what I want to focus on today are these groups, the social media groups and the book contact groups. When you're talking about an era like I am with the Revolutionary War, for instance, there are specific places that I need to go to get information. And as I begin to do my research, it becomes more and more evident of who's well-versed and who's not, and who specifically, right down to the person, do I need to talk to. And so one of the things you'll do within this network is to start creating, and I recommend even just a binder. If you're a paper person, just keep a binder with tabs with A, B, C, and D, and start filing them in these categories. Or you can do this on your computer, or you can do it inside of your contacts, in your phone. You can label them. But, you really want, I have some notes here, so I'm following along. As a writer, it's really important as you're working on your book to not so much follow writers. You really need to follow those people and engage with those people who are going to help you produce your best work. And those are trusted and frank sources on a variety of topics. So for instance, within the American Revolutionary time period, I know that there's the David Library up in Pennsylvania that has recently merged with the American Philosophical Association, and they moved their whole library there. So in terms of libraries, now those two for me have become one. I have certain historical places like Colonial Williamsburg, as you can well imagine, is a place where I hang out a lot. There are trade organizations. There are different types of groups, like I'm part of the Historical Novel Society. So these are some of my social groups as well. But I just keep tabs on these as I go through, because inevitably, especially with a research project, you're going to be at it a long while, and it's really easy to forget several years later, and I mean years, it took me 10 years from the time I had that idea to actually finish and publish the book. So 10 years later, I was having to go back through these old emails and everything and compile this list. So this list helps as you go, build the names and contacts of people that you've been in touch with along the way, because inevitably all those people become readers. So you want to keep this list. You can let them know, hey, the book is finished and you might want to buy it and share it with people. But at the same time, you're going to need to go back to these people again and again as you do more research, as your questions deepen. So this includes also, for museums and historical places, it includes the names of docents that you talk to. It may be the person that runs the bookstore at that organization. There can be art historians. A friend of mine, she deals a lot with death in her books. And so she's got a mortician on her list because she needs to have references about bodies a lot. So it expands quite exponentially. And it all starts here in the middle with that author and the era or your topic that you're working on. So just as for example, for me too, I have historical reenactors down here. I have hired by the hour historical reenactors to take me on tours in cities. And those people have become readers later on. I hired a guy who plays Ben Franklin in Philadelphia who gave me a 3-hour tour. He showed up with maps. He's helped me with gear. He was one of my early readers to make sure I had terminology correct, that all of my Ben Franklin scenes were correct. So it really does help to create this chart and get to know who's in which category for you. Once you kind of establish the chart, you're going to continue to fill it out as you go. And part of the research that you do is going to be really based on this asset of understanding the importance of communication with other people. And so I have some best practices that I'm going to share in terms of how to communicate with people, with those reenactors, with historians, with museums, with other writers, with other academics. And I base it on this. Cokie Roberts was one of the people I talked to, and there are moments, if you don't communicate well, you'll get Cokie Roberts' disapproving face. What are you doing? I'm so busy. I have so much time. You should have been better informed when you came and asked me that question. But this is the face you want from Cokie Roberts, and you want a response from her, which I did indeed get via email. And it was a very happy response with very specific information. So as you're beginning your communication with people and getting you to help write and do research, just think of Cokie Roberts' face. How are you going to make Cokie Roberts happy, even though she's no longer with us, sadly? And the way that you do that, first of all, is you learn before contacting Cokie Roberts or before contacting any of these people here, including there's my friend Bill Ochester, who plays Ben Franklin in Philadelphia. Before contacting any of them, I read as much as I could about the subject that they had written upon or that they had been immersed in. There's nothing worse than finally getting an email through to an historian and you're asking a very, very basic research question that they answered in the first chapter of the first book they've ever published. It just shows a lack of diligence on your part. So you really want to learn and read as much as you can by that person or about the subject that they're well versed in so that you can ask more specific questions. I will tell you, I never hesitated to reach out to an historian, an academic, a politician, a contact in a city looking for help for a tour. I never, ever hesitated to reach out and introduce myself in an email firsthand and tell them what I was looking for. And with the exception of one person, everybody got back to me within 24 to 48 hours. So it's very easy to get information, especially if you're working with academics and historians, because they're just so happy somebody's reading the work. I actually got an email from an academic he thanked me profusely for even taking out the book he wrote as his dissertation because he's pretty sure no one else read it. So first of all, you need to learn everything. Second of all, introduce yourself. I tell you what, there is nothing like an email that says, I'm an author and I'm working on a book about X that results in a response. People love to help authors. They think we're magical beings, even though we're just real people, just running through a bunch of notes and putting words in order. But introducing yourself as an author and an historian in your own right, looking for information, will result in a response. You need to be very specific about what you're asking. Asking general questions, I guess, goes back to what you did or didn't learn. The more you learn about something, the more specifically you could ask. With Cokie Roberts, for instance, when I wrote her, I specifically asked her for information about sources that she knew regarding women being left alone in the city of Philadelphia during the years 76 to 78. And I referenced a couple of notes that she had in one of her books. And did she have sources beyond those? And that was the information that I got from her. It's really important to follow up if you are not clear about the questions, or you need a phone call to ask whether or not you can actually have that phone call. And then also a word of thanks is really important. And if they go above and beyond, I write a handwritten thank you note and I send it. So those are some really important things that you need to do. As I said, I am an immersive researcher. I like to go to all the places I feature in the book. And that, for me, with Carrying Independence, was going as far south as Yorktown, Virginia, all the way up to Connecticut, and as many places as I could in between. It's part of the reason the research took so long, but it's also part of the joy of doing the research, is being able to immerse yourself. But you need to be well prepared. And that preparation actually does start at home. And in pandemic times, we have a lot more at our disposal than we used to. For instance, you have a lot of groups doing these 360 tours right now at Mount Vernon. You can go onto their website and you can tour not only the grounds, but go into the house, into each of the rooms. They have things marked. You can poke and point at them, and they give you some background information. So you can do a lot of virtual tours. YouTube, of course, has just about any video on any subject you could possibly want. I needed to learn how to skin a pheasant for one of my chapters, and YouTube was how I learned how to do that. I did not actually do it myself. A girl has certain limits. So blogs is another way. There are a lot of people, me included, who have blogs where we talk about the things that we've learned. But when you start getting into specific history blogs or topic blogs, you can learn a lot more. I have a girlfriend who, her husband suffered a massive brain injury, and she was the editor and blogged for many, many years on a massive brain trauma website about the different effects of brain trauma. So if you're going to be writing a character who has that, for instance, following a blog like that is really going to get you that firsthand knowledge that you may not be able to get if you can't travel from home. Interviews is really important. Again, you know, you go back to that networking chart and you start looking at the people in those categories that are going to be your best benefit, best sources, I mean, in terms of that firsthand information. My conversations that I had with Bill Ochester, who plays Ben Franklin, almost yielded me more information than the actual maps and drawings and notes that he sent me afterward, because the back and forth interviews, you conduct them as if you are writing a column for the New York Times. You know, you sit down and you have a list of questions and you go through it with people. So setting up interviews, especially now with FaceTime and Skype and WhatsApp, we can have those face-to-face conversations one-on-one like you're doing with me now. And we're going to talk about maps and timelines on the next one, because there are a couple sources out there that are incredibly helpful. I mean, certainly there are map collections. The Boston Library has an amazing map collection. But I loved David Rumsey's map collection online. For me, it was incredibly valuable to look at historic maps. It's a huge historic map collection from all over the world. It's not just North America, but you can very specifically look for time, for year, for place, location. And in the last couple of years, that David Rumsey collection has added what they call a georeferencer. So I can pull up a 1776 map of the middle colonies of the United States, and it will overlay it over a current day Google map. And I can toggle the old map to kind of make it go away and come back a little bit, so I can see the old map over a current day map. So I can really put myself exactly where I want to with my characters. The other thing is keeping a timeline. This Aeon timeline is a software. I think it's about $45 online. It's very complicated. You can kind of get lost in it if you want to. It does sync with a writing software that I use called Scrivener. But the Aeon timeline, if you're writing sci-fi, for instance, and you are creating a whole world with its own calendar, this timeline software can actually help you create a fictional calendar. It doesn't have to be real time. But for me, I can put the current and I can put the actual events in one portion of the timeline, and then I can create fictional events for each of my characters, and I can move them around, and it'll show me where they line up with those exact events that were historical or current day events. If you're researching something, as recent as how things went in the 2020 election, you can go back and put in current day events, and you can line up what it is that you're specifically doing within Aeon timeline. So those are two online resources that I would recommend getting into with research. But once you have done enough armchair travel, and hopefully, vaccines willing and all that, we're able to travel again. There is some planning that is involved in going on research junkets. For me, I coupled them with vacations so that we could camp and fish and hike and bike and do a whole bunch of things along the way as well. But some things to consider, of course, is which season you're going in. You can see on the right-hand side, this is down at Yorktown, actually, and it's the height of summer. That's a very different scene if I go back in the winter, but also in the winter, the reenactors aren't there. So I need to make sure I'm traveling to get the most out of the research that I'm doing. So it's based on what I'm writing, but it's also based on what's available to me during those research moments. Sometimes going to some of these places, some of the historic places in wintertime, if it's not related to your story, is sometimes better because the crowds are thinner and docents can spend a lot more time with you. So, again, that's why that research ahead of time, that armchair travel, is so important. And so is your networking list, so you can get to know who to talk to, when is the best time to come. Again, with the contacts there, anytime that I traveled somewhere, I reached out ahead of that visit to see if someone was going to be there that I could meet with, and actually scheduled it with a contact. And for instance, I live in Virginia. I was going to New York. New York's expensive. You've got to make sure that you're pretty much on task the whole time you're in Manhattan, or you're going to run out of funding pretty quickly. But I needed to go to a place called the Francis Tavern, which is an original tavern from 1776 down in the Wall Street area. I wrote them ahead of time. I did research on them. I wrote them ahead of time, told them when I was coming. And when I got there, I spoke with the woman, and they were having a really quiet day. So they took me up into the Francis Tavern offices. They pulled books from their bookshelves. They spread maps on the table. I was with them about an hour and a half in their offices, just asking question after question, which was pretty fabulous. And when I was done, instead of telling me the different places that I needed to go, it was one of the women, it was her lunch break. So she went with me, and she took me to all these places in Lower Manhattan and showed me all the places that were there during that revolutionary period. So reaching out ahead of time is really important as part of your travel planning. And of course, budgeting is also really important. There are some opportunities for housing and research that you can find along the way. The American Antiquarian Society, for instance, in Worcester, Massachusetts, I got a fellowship there for creative writers, and I got a month of being able to stay in the house for nothing. They have a house associated with the library. So my housing cost me nothing. So I could stay for a month and research. And I just booked my regular life on either side of that. But there are funding grants, they're a little harder right now with pandemic. A lot of people lost their funding during some of the pandemic times. So you may need to budget a little differently, but let's just assume that we're going to be back in real life times eventually. There are some libraries that have reduced housing costs associated with them as well. If you go to I think it's the the Library Company in Philadelphia, for instance, they have a federal house just down the block from the library, and it's $400 a week for researchers who come in. Now, the average hotel cost in Philadelphia is usually like $150 a night. So 450 for a whole week is a huge difference. And so long as you're doing research there, you can spend your evenings and your weekend running around doing other things in the same place. So creating a budget of what you're going to be doing, but then looking for some funding. Poets and Writers magazine online also has a long list of fellowships and funding opportunities for creative writers, including writers in residence programs and things like that. So go to Poets and Writers online and look for free funding or fellowships or things like that there. Also important, now that you're going to be going out, let's assume that you've got all your planning done, you have your network, you have your contacts, and you have the long list of things you want to achieve while you're traveling. Let's talk about organizing that field data a little bit as you go in. Even though I've done my map work before I go, one of the things I pick up are the maps of places that I go, because the visitor maps that they get really provide more specific information, a general lay of the land, and they also make it really approachable for people who aren't historians. So those maps are usually, you could probably say dumbed down, but they're made for the people that don't understand where they are on the planet. And so they're a lot more simplified, which makes the writing much more simple when you get home. And that also goes for visitor guides. I pick up visitor guides at a lot of the places that I go to because they will summarize some of the history in there. They'll give me background and information on people that were of importance for whatever place that I'm visiting. They also tend to provide a little context in terms of, why was that place that's important then? Why is that important to us now? Some of that is within visitor guides. I also recommend asking about perspective. We take on the ground tours a lot, but when you're working with docents, asking them if there are places or photographs or imagery of a different perspective. This image on the right-hand side is the Custom House at Yorktown. It was there during the Revolutionary period. It's been completely reconstructed. And when you're down there, it feels like a really small space because it's walled in, but it's only in having this aerial shot that I get a real sense of where it is in relationship to the water, in relationship to the gardens in the back, how big is the space, how empty are the streets around it, some things like that. So gathering some perspective is important. And then having a collection of your own photographs is really important too. But one of the most important things on your journey is going to be your senses. And I don't know if you remember these from like elementary school where they would send you on a nature walk and they would give you these census charts and you had to fill them in. These are actually really great charts to take with you when you're out there doing research. Because for instance, I mean, you saw this photograph that I had before, but it's just a photograph when you get home. However, at the moment that those rifles are firing, if I have this census sheet with me and I can talk about what I heard in terms of those rifles being fired, what it felt like the reverberation of 6 or 8 rifles firing at one time, what that feels like in my chest, the sulfur smell of the gunpowder after it's been shot. There's a lot of these senses that you can then bring home and wrap into your writing. And I usually have a note across the top of the page that says where and when I was, because if you hit 8 spots on the way home, it's not going to be quite as clear of where everything is when you get home as it is in the moment. So I try to keep those census studies done while I'm right there in the moment. So what do you do with all this information when you get home is part of the problem. And the first thing you need to do, of course, is to organize all that data. I mean, you've brought mounds of paperwork home and maps and notes. So the first thing is to go back in, and any files that you have on your computer. I don't know if you're a paper person or a computer person. I am primarily paperless. So I transfer a lot of information into digital files on my computer. I like having them all in one place. I'm not a real big paper junkie. You can photograph things like your 5 census sheets and put them into the different sections depending on where you are and what they belong with. Now is a good time to update your timeline with if you're working on just a physical timeline. I know a friend who has, an entire whiteboard on one wall, and she keeps a timeline there. So she updates timelines when she comes home, like physically by hand, or whether or not you're an Aeon timeline, you're going to learn some new information and you're going to want to insert that into your timeline. With the 5 census sheets, you're going to want to review those and connect them with any specific events that you're keeping track of. Again, you're going to want to update that networking chart. Surely, as for instance, I was in Francis Tavern. Jennifer, who was my contact, was in the room, but someone else was too, and they gave me a card. So I have to update that networking chart with their information when I get home. And then, of course, you eliminate and refine things. Remember that iceberg, you're going to have to just determine what goes in and what goes out. And then you can get down to the actual act of writing. I recommend that you write your thank you notes first, because timeliness is next to godliness when it comes to that. So you want to make sure that you follow up with all the people that you've met with, write them thank you notes or thank you emails, however you prefer to do it, or they will appreciate the most. And in those follow-up emails, if you have any lingering questions, because you've just finished going through all your notes, if you have any lingering questions, now's the time to follow up. But relatively soon after you get home from a trip like that, or when you have finished researching a section, you need to then write it. Our memories are short and they are faulty. And having that information quickly, if I did a research trip a year ago for a section that I'm not going to write until 6 months from now, I'm going to forget the stuff that I learned, that visceral feeling that I had. So you're going to want to write those as quickly as possible. So I have just 2 other notes, suggestions that I want to talk about, and it pertains a little bit to this picture. So this is an illustration that John Trumbull did of inside a prison ship during the American Revolution. And John Trumbull, he did that big painting of the Declaration of everybody signing the Declaration of Independence. He did that later in life, but during the Revolutionary War, he was a war correspondent, and he had illustrations like this. And I have a scene in which I'm trying to write about a prisoner inside the prison ships. Looking at these things is really important, but as a novelist, again, like my job is right here, right? It's to be small and to think about the individual and how they are impacted by all the things that I've been learning. And so that brings me down to a couple of research things that I like to suggest. Don't forget that life has downtime. Like we put a lot of action into books, but there's a lot of everyday things that have to happen, right? People have to do laundry, they have to eat. My characters ended up, because it's the revolutionary period, they ended up at a ball, so they have to learn how to dance. So as far as the research goes, it's not all work. It can be really fun. I took contra dance lessons. Like I said, there was an extra on Mercy Street just to find out what the clothes were like. Life has downtime, and you need to really understand what that's like. And I kind of put it into this sentence that soldiers don't always fight and lovers don't always have sex. So soldiers may be fighting some of the time, but there's going to be times that they're reading. What are they reading? There's going to be times that they are going to have to just, polish their boots. What is it that they use to do that? The other suggestion that I have is to let you know that the past is now. It's very easy if you're doing research to constantly subvert yourself. And for me, like the late 1700s, but people are people regardless of that time period. The washerwoman who did laundry back then is not unlike us doing laundry now. We still sometimes hang our laundry out to dry. But for instance, if you're writing a book like I am about war, and I have military sections and I have people suffering from PTSD. Well, right now we have veterans who are suffering from PTSD. And there's a lot of research online that I can read about them. There are veterans hospitals where I can go talk to them. The importance is that these are character stories that we're writing when we're writing fiction. And even when we're writing nonfiction, Boys in the Boat that I mentioned before, that's nonfiction. But I follow a very specific character throughout that whole book, a very specific person who was real. So making sure that you're talking to people now and you're being observant about how people do things now is part of the joy of the writing. Which brings us to the Benjamin Franklin quote. He said, write something worth reading or do something worth writing. And I say both, do both. So I am going to open it up to questions now. I will let you know that I do have another talk that you can view online called Researching Women from an Historical Novelist Perspective. And I talk about taking that networking chart and building a similar networking chart with the character that you're researching from that past and building their networking chart. So if you go onto YouTube and you just type in my name and Researching Women, you will probably find a video of that. And I do meet with book clubs and things like that. But let me stop sharing and I'm more than happy to take any questions.
All right, well, if you can unmute yourself, feel free to do that and ask questions. If you can't, just raise your hand and I'll get you. But I do have 2 questions in the chat for Karen. The first one, how do you create the right voice for your character's dialogue? There's got to be a middle ground between writing like the characters would say in 2021 and writing the way they really spoke.
Right. That's a great question. And I was given advice early on by an historian, for gosh sakes, do not use the vernacular of the time period that they were living in. It's too hard to read that on an ongoing basis. So just as a, for instance, in terms of adding some of the texture from the time period in there, or with regard to accents, this is another thing if you have a character with an accent. In my book, my main character runs into a guy from Boston, and rather than trying to mimic the Boston accent in his speech, the first time Nathaniel meets him, he says that Captain Bligh pronounced the word here more like hair with that thick Boston accent. And that was enough to get the person reading to understand that the captain had an accent. I don't need to do it the rest of the time. And especially, I was just working on a book from a friend of mine, and she has all the African-American people talking like Mammy from Gone with the Wind, but none of the white people have this language. So you have to be very careful that you're paying attention to how you're treating all of your characters equally and the way that you're displaying their language throughout the book. But in terms of character voice, so I heard this at a writing conference years ago, and I absolutely loved it. I thought it was such great advice. I take Myers-Briggs tests as my characters. So I went and I took a Myers-Briggs test as me, so I make sure I know who I am. And then, I kind of do a little paragraph or two of who I think Nathaniel is and the kind of things that he is like. And then I go and I try and take the Myers-Briggs test like him. And then it spits out the answer at the end and it gives you the little code, right? And then you can go look up all of the things that an INFJ is. And in addition to how they tend to approach things. It says where their blockers are, which is really important in characters, right? They need to not be able to see where they're blocked, and they have to work to overcome those things. And the Myers-Briggs test has a section on here's where you're blocked and here's what you need to overcome given your circumstances. So that was really helpful of getting into the character headspace. It's almost like an actor, like, how Daniel Day-Lewis, they talk about him, like he gets so immersed in being Lincoln that when they shot it here in Richmond, he walked around like he was Lincoln the whole time, and he stayed in a house that was more like what Lincoln would have stayed in. And you kind of do that with each of your characters. If they are historical, real people, for instance, Oliver Wolcott from Connecticut is in my book. There's a prolific number of letters that he wrote, and I read a lot of his letters to start to get to understand how he would phrase things. And you can lift a phrase or two of his that he repeats frequently. Some of that is cadence, but dialogue is, I read it out loud. I read a book on dialogue that said when we're speaking, we really tend to not speak in full sentences. People interrupt one another. Look, I'm not even completing my sentences right now. So you listen to how people talk and then write how people talk. And sometimes the best of writers are the ones who are quiet at parties, and you just listen to the way people interact. And that's another way too. I mean, how my sister-in-law talks from California is very different to how my partner Ted from New Jersey talks. So just lifting voice from the people in your life is a good way to create dialogue too. Dialogue's a big one. It's hard. It's for a lot of people, it's really hard, but if you listen, you'll get it more than if you talk. You said
Okay.
there was another question in there?
Yeah, I actually have a couple. Another dialogue question. Do you worry about saying the exact words that maybe Ben Franklin would say, since your readers might not exactly know what was said?
Right. If I find quotes that I think are really pretty pithy, or they're really good, or they're very important for, if there's documented dialogue from that time period, I will insert some of it. Sometimes I will alter it just a little, but I usually, like, Kim, I know you've read the book. So in the back, I have a fact versus fiction where I kept track of what I changed versus what I kept. But pretty much if I can find a good quote, like one of the founding fathers who was not at that formal signing, when it finally came time for him to sign it, his brother was trying to discourage him from doing it. His name was Lewis Morris, and his quote from him is, "Damn the consequences, hand me the pen." Well, you can bet your bottom dollar I used that in the book. It was a great quote. And so an entire scene was wrapped around me leading up to Lewis Morris saying that. And I ended with him saying that in a chapter. When people are dead and gone, as long as they're in quotes, you can use those quotes in the book.
Okay. What is one thing that you wish you had known before writing your first book?
One thing with regard to the writing and the research, I wish I'd been better organized in the beginning. I wish I'd had that networking chart when I started. I didn't. And so that was a lot to catch up on later on, is keeping everything organized. I underestimated how much I didn't know about the time period, and it took me longer. So I guess having patience about how long the historical fiction was going to take for my type of historical fiction. Going back to that iceberg, some people don't need to know the depths of stuff that I did, because my fiction is so factually based. The 10% that I show is an enormous amount of information. There's Danielle Steele, for instance. She's one of the top historical novelists of all time. I don't imagine that she knows this or shows the same 10% of information in her books that I show in mine. Her 10% probably looks more like, my 0.1% that she shows in the book. So what she has to learn is different. So I guess setting down some rules for yourself or some idea for yourself of how thick is your historical fiction going to be? Is it going to be romance basically loosely based in a time period, or is it going to be intrinsically tied to the events of a time period? That makes a huge difference in the amount of information you're going to need to know. Publishing wise, I wish I had known more about self-publishing and independent publishing before I started publishing. Because to traditionally publish is extremely daunting and deflating, and the rejections are huge. I mean, I had 100 rejections of Carrying Independence before I published. I ended up independently publishing Carrying Independence, and I'm not ashamed to say I did, and I'm not sorry I did, because it's gone on to win numerous awards, including being one of the top 100 indie published books of 2019. And I have a fabulous reader base. I sold 3,000 copies in the first year, which for a book is pretty darn good. And it's still growing like crazy now. And I got fellowships for the writing. So I know that a lot of us want to traditionally published, and the idea that we're going to get that, $50,000, $150,000 signing bonus with by getting an agent, you have a better chance of being accepted into Harvard or Mensa than you do in getting an agent. So, my advice would be to learn as much about independent publishing as possible while you're also learning to write. It's very fun, independent publishing too. There's lots of facets about it that are really joyful. And you're going to be, even with a traditionally publishing contract, doing such a big chunk of the work in terms of marketing that book, in terms of connecting with your readers, that the more you know about it, the more joyful the whole process is going to be. And that right now, as the publishers shrink, I think when I started work on Carrying Independence, there were 7 major independent publishers. There are now 4. So as those shrink and the independent publishing options open up, it's kind of never been a better time to be a writer. Your options are twice what they used to be.
Okay. Do you get burned out over time, and how do you get back into writing?
Yeah, there are lulls that you go through where you just can't even look at a book anymore. And vacations are a good way to get away from that. So on a daily basis, I still have some marketing work that I do for clients. I do marketing and brand work for clients, and that usually gives me a break. Physical activity is a big one. There's nothing like a walk or a bike ride to clear my head on something that's not working out. Same with sleep. So I would say that exercise and eating healthy and making sure that you get a good night's sleep will make you a better writer in the long run, and it'll help you endure those moments when the words just don't feel like they're coming. I don't really have what I call writer's block. I'm one of those people that doesn't necessarily believe in writer's block. I think you just don't know enough. You don't know enough about yourself or the research or the people around you. I recommend getting a therapist. I think every writer who has a good therapist will understand characters better and understand themselves better. That insight into you is going to help you see what you can't in terms of your character growth. You don't know if you're the antagonist or the protagonist until you sit down with a therapist, right? So it's really important that you understand which side of that sofa you're sitting on. But it does really help. And then, there are periods where I will leave a book for a while because I can't see the problems with it. And that is the time to bring in someone else, to bring in an editor, to bring in beta readers or friends that you really trust who will be frank with you about what your writing is doing. And while that book is sitting with them, you don't look at it, so that when it comes back, you're open to what might be not working.
All right. What are ways of helping a writer deter themselves from their historical fiction evolving into nonfiction and nonfiction turning into fiction?
Hey, print out that picture of the iceberg and tape it to your monitor, and tell yourself you can't do that. It- so this is such a good question. So with regard to both historical fiction and historical nonfiction, it comes down to following character, right? Like we want to see the impact of those events on a person. Um, the the difference, I think, is that in nonfiction, the person absolutely has to be real, and they always do. And in fiction, they don't have to be. Nathaniel isn't totally invented. The people around him, there's 50 people in the book who are all real. Um, but in order to prevent carrying independence from slipping downhill into nonfiction, I have to keep coming back to how Nathaniel feels. I mean, that's a big part of it. If I'm not showing the history through his eyes and through how a person individually is impacted, it's impossible for the reader to keep going along. Story really has to trump it, as opposed to the facts. You've got to eventually stop doing the research too. Like if you look back at that picture that I had of the iceberg, there's a circle around it, right? And that means I don't waver outside the circle. That even my book is set in 76 to 77. And when I started to see dates that said 78, 79, I stopped myself and came back in because that was information I didn't need to know. So some of it is to stop it's like caving. You got to stop spelunking at some point. Your rope's going to run out and you need to get back out. So, but this is also where other readers come in, where your editors and your beta readers, they'll tell you when you've wandered too far into nonfiction. If you're writing fiction, they'll tell you when they're not connecting with your characters anymore because you're just jamming too many dates in. I've often said writers work alone, but authors need multiple people in their lives, and that includes early readers that will help us see what we can't. I don't, did I answer that person's question enough or well enough?
Yeah, that was great. Okay, we are almost out of time, but we have one last question.
Okay.
Does any character become your muse during character development?
Do my characters actually become my muse? I know I'm the puppeteer, right? So I know authors who say like there are these characters and people standing behind them and they are just channeling them into the work. I'm not that way. I'm far too practical. So I know that I'm creating the characters, and I know, especially the fictional ones, I know that I'm manipulating them and making them do certain things. But at the same time, it's parents will never admit it, but I think you like some children more than others. So, certainly Nathaniel and Arthur and Suzanne and Kalawi for me are all really special, but because I created them all. But Nathaniel for me is so much more important because he was my main character. And so I constantly keep coming back to how do the things that those other people are doing affect Nathaniel. So he becomes a driver for me. And certainly when the book was done and finally out, I mean, I love getting to talk about him because for me, he's kind of real now. Have you seen Stranger Than Fiction with Emma Thompson, where she's writing the book about a character and then Will Ferrell shows up as the character? You start to see your character in people out in public and stuff. It's kind of weird. It's kind of fun, but yeah, I guess so. They almost become like pets or children to you. They become real in some way, but I don't know that one of them continues to make me write, if that answers the question. And we are out of time, you said, and look, we're a small group here and I'm totally open to questions. My email is info@karenachase.com. If you were too shy today to ask a question or something comes up, please feel free to email me.
Well, I want to thank you so much. Look at that. Chris posted the
Yeah.
your email. Yeah, we are a well-oiled machine here. Anyway, I want to thank you so much, Karen. It's funny because I think one of the things that, students will find out that I don't know, they love science fiction, or there's a particular type of book they found when they were 12, and that becomes their forever. And I think one of the things that you have brought to this, in addition to some real practical information, is the awareness that there are as many slices of types of writing and types of personalities and backgrounds to making that true as there are people who read, like it's just and one of the things that I so appreciated, and I recommend that everybody make the plunge, go get the book, that one of the things I so totally appreciated about Caring Independence is it's both so incredibly accurate feeling and eminently readable. Like I'm not a history buff beyond it's sort of important, but if somebody's rattling off what battle happened in what year, I just I just go to white noise, But for this, it's like, oh goodness, I do give a damn, like it's really, all of a sudden history is real. So I want to thank Karen for first being here with us and sort of sharing her process, and then also for just being an amazing writer who
Thank
is
you.
fun to read. And yeah,
Been
so
a long journey.
anyway, thank you to all my thank you to all my students, and we had a few people who were not in our class here, for asking good questions. And I'll send you all an email to tell you what's coming up next. And once again, thank you, Karen.
Thank you so much, everyone. I appreciate you coming today.